So I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Amy Jiang from MIT, CSAIL at MIT. Amy's, you might recognize her from her 2 internships she did at MSR and also maybe conferences. She's very active in the research community. As we were just saying, Amy has quite a list of accolades, probably more than kind of fit into my working memory, but I'll try and throw out a few things. So yeah, in addition to doing 2 internships here at MSR, Amy was a Gates Fellow, is that what it's called? Yeah, at Cambridge, where she got her master's in computer science prior to going to MIT. Amy was a Google Research Fellowship winner and did a couple of internships at Google Research as well as here at MSR. Amy was also a NSF Graduate Research Fellowship winner and has quite a stellar publication record, including Best Paper Honorable Mentions and Best Paper Award-winning work. So today we're going to hear about her primary line of work going into her dissertation, which is about ways to improve online discussion. And then actually, so order of business. So I know people watching remotely. I'm following the chat on the ResNet link. So if remote folks have questions, go ahead and I can ask those via the chat. Do you want to take questions throughout or save for the end? Or
throughout is fine.
Throughout is fine. Okay, so we'll take questions throughout. So great, let's welcome Amy.
Okay, hi everyone. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so in the last several decades, as you all know, technology has really revolutionized how we collect and manage and display information. We've been able to do so many really awesome things, right? So it's really kind of amazing when you think about how much our lives have changed thanks to things like the internet, Google, Wikipedia, et cetera. When we have all these capabilities and all these tools to be able to collect and build on each other's knowledge. However, when you look around today on the internet, it seems like discussion is this one area where we haven't really seen this like big leap forward, right? In fact, some people might even say that online discussion has gotten really worse over time. And if you don't believe me, here's some examples. So this was an article that showed up on my feed a couple weeks ago. I was like, okay, seems important. But yeah, so the term email overload has been around since 1996, and in fact, I'm sure people were experiencing it way before that, but it's something that we're still experiencing today, right? Besides just the number of messages that we're all drowning in, we're also drowning in the number of places where discussion occurs. So, speaking of Slack, some people thought just a few years ago, like, oh, Slack would come around, it'd be this big email killer, it would solve all of our problems, but, not only is email as alive as ever, as I'm sure you can all attest, we have this new problem now, and it's called Slack overload. And if you use group chat for work, I think you can know about this.
Huh? Between those 2 Slack?
What?
No, 3 years.
So this is 2015, this is 2018. Right, so things are not getting better. Here's another article headline that kind of, I would say, nicely encapsulates some of the general sentiment around online discussion today. A trash fire. And I would say this is actually kind of optimistic, right? So things haven't really improved since 2016 even. And, fed up with this problem, no good solutions in sight, a lot of sites have actually closed down their online comment sections. So the NPR, Atlantic, Popular Science, all these places have said, we don't know how to deal with this, so we're just going to shut it down. And at this point, it's gotten kind of so bad that we're now blaming our systems for online discourse for these big and terrible things like bringing about the downfall of democracy, right? Seems bad. We do not want that to happen. So when we think back then, what sort of problems are we still grappling with today when it comes to online discussion that are still around, maybe have even gotten worse over time? So one of these is scale. Discussions are just online too long for anyone to read, and it leads to all these down the road issues. So this here I grabbed is like 1/3 of a Wikipedia talk page for the Wikipedia article on Jane Austen. Really controversial subject. I think they're talking about citations or something. But yeah, this is just too long to read. And this was a problem in the 90s. But it's gotten worse and worse over time because it's just happening everywhere. 2,000 comments, 3,000 comments. Everyone's kind of amplifying and talking and amplifying again, but how easy is it to actually listen to all the things that are being said? A second issue I'll mention is sort of all these different discussion systems that we're currently juggling. And I would actually call these discussion silos, right? So this problem of discussions kind of happening in one place, which is only about discussion, and that's separate from everything else that's happening on the web. And what happens when you have all these different discussion silos is now you have like all these different places where you're like, okay, here is where I'm having a discussion about this with these people, and then you have to juggle all this. And what happens when you have all these different discussion compartmentalization issues is the discussion of something is happening separate from where that something is actually happening. So one example of this is like Piazza, for instance. If you've ever used this before, it's like education software where people are discussing in forums about their class. But you might be discussing about a piece of course material. Meanwhile, the actual course material is existing like in a textbook somewhere. Another example is like for work. So maybe you are discussing work, if you're a programmer, in Slack, for instance. Meanwhile, your actual work is happening over in GitHub. So these two things are not connected. And what happens when you have these two things not connected is you have a kind of this loss of context, right? It's hard to reference what you're talking about. And then you have a loss of discovery, right? So when you're over here and you're reading these things, it's hard to know what's being discussed about what you're reading about. And then the last problem I'll mention is this issue of all these different groups of people, different types of norms, different behavior coexisting on these same social platforms and leading to issues. So anything from just like simmering tensions, general passive aggressiveness, leading to bickering, maybe polarization between different tribes. And then it kind of can devolve from there. So things like bad actors, riling things up on the major platforms, trolling. Now we have these really large like misinformation campaigns, disinformation, sometimes led by state actors, to these large harassment campaigns that we're seeing online. So lots of problems. A natural question to ask then is, why isn't online discussion getting better, right? All these other things are getting better. Why is this one thing on the internet not getting better? Yeah.
I don't know if this jumps you ahead or anything, but I'm trying to figure out, other than scale, are you identifying anything that's different about online discussion from discussion as it existed before the internet? I mean, if you go to any city council meeting, a lot of these, it's all the same. I mean, I don't really see the difference except for scale.
Anonymity, identity, spoofing.
There's issues of identity. There's issues in the online context, kind of like what I mentioned about loss of context, right? So you have these discussions, but they're kind of existing in this online space, but where does that in relation to like the space of the people you're talking to, for instance? Yeah, and I think there's scale in terms of like quantity of things to look at, which was the first thing, but there's also scale in terms of like diversity of people and thought and behaviors that you're interacting with, that norms, for instance, are not very clear in the online space. Yeah. Okay, so why is online discussion not getting better? So I argue then, actually, if you think about the tools that we use every day for online discussion, things like email, chat, forums, comment sections, etc., when it comes to their basic structure, they haven't really changed fundamentally in a long time, sometimes even decades. So for instance, email is still email. Maybe at some point you used IRC, now maybe you use Slack or some other tool. PHP BB forums back in the day are now things like Discourse and Reddit. Sure, some things are different. Like, I think we can all agree, like the design and the usability of some of these tools have improved. Nowadays we have things like upvoting, which kind of moves things around on the page. We have social media now, but that's kind of like a forum structure overlaid on top of a social graph. So these things are different, but fundamentally the structure of these things haven't really changed that much in a really long time. So if the question then is how might we actually improve the structure of online discourse, I would say if you think back to all the great advances I was talking about, what did these advances include? They included two things, I would say. So one, people, right? The efforts of people being able to build on each other's work, more people making a thing better. Versus discussion, it's like more things, more people, and discussion gets worse, right? So there's that kind of difference there. And then the second thing is tools, right? Tools to basically make that possible. So for example, today, if you were going to go to a discussion forum to find a particular piece of information, or you wanted to fact check something that someone said, chances are it was probably difficult to do. It was kind of like a cumbersome task. And then second of all, once you were done, no one could build on your work, right? So you've done this work to find this thing, now it's gone when you're done, and no one else can actually do anything with it. So then what I argue is what we need is actually new tools. Tools that actually give people the power to be able to add structured information, to improve and tailor their discussions and their discussion environments to what they want, and then also tools to be able to build on each other's work. And so this was basically the topic of my PhD. So this idea of collaborative tools for structuring online discourse. And then I focused on these three main columns of techniques, basically. And then for each technique, building a set of systems that kind of explore that technique in a specific domain. So one of these techniques is this question of summarization. So basically, how can you get people to collaboratively boil down a large discussion into something that's easy for newcomers to read? And here I was looking at both large discussion threads and then long group chat comments. The second is this question of getting these discussions outside of their silos into the broader context, into the broader world, and through the technique of anchoring. So basically attaching discussions to particular places. And here I've been looking at that in the case of like educational materials and also broadening to the web in general. And then third, for this issue of different competing norms on the same platform, the way that we've been working to deal with that is to build stronger tools to give people the ability to do more fine-grained moderation, basically. So being able to control what comes in and what goes out. And here we've been looking in email, particularly mailing lists, and then also this case of online harassment. Okay, so with most of my work, this is kind of the research loop that I follow. First, some form of formative need finding, so trying to understand through interviews, through surveys, through large-scale content analysis, what are the problems that people have with their discussion tools. Then I try to build a system that aims to solve that problem, and then follow that up with some sort of deployment. So deploying to the wild in public, but also deploying to particular communities that I think could use this tool, seeing how they use it, and then kind of going back around that loop. But for today, I'm just going to focus on like how the systems work themselves, and you can talk to me later about the need finding stuff or the deployment stuff. Okay, so first I'm going to focus on this question of summarization and how to deal with large discussions. And here I'll focus on two things with these systems. So one, the production of summaries, so how can people effectively collaborate to summarize a large discussion? And then two, what does that final summary artifact look like? Is it something that is static or dynamic? Is it explorable? That sort of thing. First, forums. So I already started the talk telling you a little bit about how forums are really difficult to read, and it's pretty obvious if you look at it. But they also have some upsides, right? Like we go digging through them for a reason. And their upsides include things like original voices and different perspectives. So we don't necessarily want to lose that. So then the question is, when you're building something that's trying to be like a summary of a discussion, how can you build something that effectively lets you go back and forth between the two, right? So wikis, kind of like a wiki summary kind of thing, also has its own pros and cons. There are no personalities represented in the text, but they're also short, they're neutral, they're easy to read. So wouldn't it be great to be able to go back and forth between the two instead of just having one or the other? And there have been some systems that have tried to do something like this, right? So this is Quora's Answer Wiki feature. They popped basically a wiki text box at the top of their answers that come below, where in the wiki text box, anyone can go in and edit this summary of the answers. But there's a problem here, right? So these two things are totally disconnected, which means that there's no way for me to go from a particular part of the summary that I'm interested in to the answer that is actually describing that in someone's original voice. And then also, from looking at the summary, I can't actually tell whether or not to trust it, right? I have no idea whether or not it's complete. So to solve this problem, I built this tool called Wickham. It takes Wiki and form and mashes it together. And you can play with it at wickham.org. So just a sense of how it works. So first, say you have this discussion. There's all this back and forth. It's getting out of hand, as it always does. And at the end, you have this big mess of different subthreads. So then to boil down a large discussion, I have this really simple technique. It's called recursive summarization. Basically, anyone can grab a section of discussion, summarize that section. Someone else can grab another sub-discussion, part of the discussion, summarize that, so on and so forth. Someone can also summarize the summaries, so there's that recursive element, until you have a summary of the entire discussion. And then what's nice is when you summarize discussions in that way, you get this interesting artifact in the end, which is what we call a summary tree, which is something that's explorable, right? So I can read a summary at a high level, dive into a particular part of the discussion that I'm interested in, read a lower level summary, all the way down to the original discussion itself. So it becomes this kind of explorable artifact. So I'm going to show a video of this tool in action. To describe the context, I participated in this 2-week-long kind of like hackathon in Madrid, where the city of Madrid actually has this kind of like citizen democracy forum where citizens can make proposals, people can comment on them, other citizens, and then if it gets to a certain level, the city actually has to go and vote on it and perhaps implement it. And as you can see here, this is actually a really popular proposal. It got around 800-something comments. And while I was in Madrid, I talked to some city officials, and they said that they actually do not bother to read any of the comments on this forum, and because it's too difficult to read. So we thought, okay, people are having these great discussions. Could we perhaps summarize this using Wickham? So here's the tool in action. In the blue is the original comments. The orange are summaries, so they're kind of partial summaries of a part of discussion. And so you can see very clearly what is summarizing what. So that's directly beneath each of the partial summaries. And then to summarize a section of discussion, you just grab that thread, and then there are some like automatic techniques to help highlight important sentences. You can write your summary. You can add citations to the particular comments that you're interested in. And then now, whenever someone else comes to the discussion, they see that summary first before they can choose to dive into the original comments. And I didn't really show it, but there's also some elements that help with like clustering similar comments together, or tagging, where sort of over time, as you tag more, the system learns and kind of tries to suggest new tags for you. But yeah, that's the tool. Okay, so we did an evaluation of this tool, kind of comparing it to a wiki environment. In this case, we use Google Docs, where we had users basically in sequence added to different groups, where each new user in a group was asked to advance the summary of a discussion in using Wickham, and then a summary of a discussion in Google Docs, from where the last person in the group had left off. As you can see, the solid lines are Wickham and the dotted lines are Google Doc. And overall, Wickham was faster for summarizing than Google Docs, even with the same groups of people doing the summarization. And actually, as you can see in the dashed lines, they do okay at first, and then over time, they kind of seem to tail off a little bit. And we were kind of curious as to why that happened. We found the reason why was that people were actually really reluctant to edit each other's work in that condition. So what happened was people would write these like partial summaries of what they had, the discussions that they were looking at, and then they would keep like appending to what the person before had done. But nobody was working to actually summarize that further down. And so this became kind of like pages and pages long. And we didn't really have this problem in the Wickham condition because nothing is ever actually destroyed, right? So everything is kind of overlaid. Every time you write a summary, it's overlaying on top of another. So there was no roadblock of this kind.
Question?
Mm-hmm.
So
So the way you described it, it sounded sort of phased, where discussion happens first, then someone comes along and summarizes it.
Yeah.
But I assume it's sort of iterative, like people can add summaries to discussions even as they're kind of ongoing. Is that right?
Yeah, so the sort of like Wickham version 1 of this was discussions over, now we do summarizing. Wickham version 2, which I'm currently working on, is this something that's more iterative, where you now have like summarization, which you could also call like reflection periods within the discussion itself. Yeah.
Yeah, part of why I ask is because I would guess that knowing that summarization is kind of happening in parallel to the discussion would affect the way people do discussion.
Yeah,
It'd be nice to test that.
That would be a really interesting thing to see, because I think one of our hypotheses was that right now you see in a lot of these large discussions a lot of redundancy, right? And the question is, well, would there be less redundancy if it were easy to see what has already been said? Because a lot of times people just...
I'm also thinking of tangents. So people, like, I read a lot of Reddit, for example, and people go off on these like little snark fests that have nothing to do with what the actual discussions is about. And if they knew that there were like these summarizers who were paying attention, and if the purpose, maybe if there was a certain seriousness of purpose to the discussion, maybe they would just avoid that behavior, for example. I don't know. It's interesting to see behavioral changes.
Yeah, or maybe they would be interested in summarizing their own discussion and adding that tangent as like, oh, this is an important tangent that we shouldn't lose, something like that. Yeah?
So I'm wondering, how does this actually affect consumption of these stories, comments, and so on? Because that's the first thing you mentioned is who's going to read all of this. So this is obviously better summarized, so there are better chances of reading all of this, but it's still difficult to read this because you can lose your way still. You look at the summary here, I'm not going to read this one, I'm going to read that one, but then you forget about the 4 other notes. You still have to traverse a tree. It's still hard to understand what was said.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think the idea there is that it puts the user a little bit more control of that. So you can decide to read at the depth that you want.
But
Yeah.
I'm still curious, if you were to actually optimize the chances that somebody will really understand all that was said, is that happening here, or is there a chance for somebody to completely forget part of the tree?
Yeah, so I think the way that we've approached it is instead of like making the normative stance that everyone should sort of like have an overview of the whole thing, that people should be able to hone in on what they want to see. And this is sort of helping them do that, and at the level they want. And so we did do a bunch of evaluations of this like summary tree artifact that we created, kind of seeing how people feel about trying to get an overview, and does this make that easier for them? And people talked a bit about how it was nice to have these like summaries that were very directly connected to what they summarized. Yeah.
As it has become painfully obvious the last week, people have opinion even about summaries.
Yes.
And I wonder if you were to observe, people starting threads of comments about the summaries, basically not solving the problem, because now it's a discussion about the summary that then you have to summarize the discussion about the summaries.
Yeah, there's this question of like meta comments where I think we would want to. So we haven't built that into the interface as a separate thing. I think we kind of would want that to be a separate thing. But the idea here is that this is kind of, the whole thing is editable, right? So all the summaries are editable. And we want to make it kind of easy to verify, right? So if you see a summary, you can check very easily like what it's summarizing and is it something that is accurately reflecting in a neutral way what was said. And with the citations, it's meant to sort of like help facilitate that.
How did you address the issue of trust? Why would anybody trust the summary if I didn't write it? How do I trust that it really encapsulates the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different things, right? So being able to see like who created the summary, what's the edit history of the summary, having the citations in the summary that link to the particular parts of the discussion, being able to, if you don't trust it, be able to see the comments that are directly beneath. These kinds of things can also help with that. And I think the way we built it is that we also built it with many different use cases in mind, right? You could use this tool sort of like as a single person trying to do this for this particular task. You could do it in a community way with a bunch of other people. You could have admins and moderators. Yeah.
You could have discussion about the summary, but I don't think that's necessarily bad. You could have a discussion about a summary. This is the right summary, no, this was the right summary. You forgot to say this, I forgot to say that. You can summarize those discussions about summaries and progressively distill the actual dialogue that happened in that thread into something that you can actually read.
Yeah, absolutely. That is exactly what we're trying to do at this point. Yeah. Okay. So speaking of kind of like different communities using this, so in the last year, we've been collaborating with the Wikimedia Foundation on whether they could perhaps use this to help in their workflow. Because as it turns out, on Wikipedia, this problem happens all the time, right? So what happens when an editor just doesn't resolve things, people go to the talk page, they have a really long argument about it, and then a neutral third party is supposed to come in, read through that entire discussion, try to understand it, summarize it, and come up with a resolution. Turns out this is a really difficult task. So we interviewed a bunch of people on Wikipedia who do this quite frequently, and it sometimes takes like many hours just for a single discussion to be summarized. And in fact, when we looked at these discussions going back in time over the last 7 years, a full 1/3 of them actually have never been resolved. Which is unfortunate, right? Because it's like people have put a lot of time and effort into this, and maybe they're being blocked on something that they would like to continue working on. But meanwhile, there's no one to kind of come in and resolve the issue. So it makes sense that this is the case because it's a really difficult thing for people to do. So lately we've been looking at whether they could use Wickham perhaps to, even for an individual, sort of help that person with the process, and also whether they could start doing it collaboratively, because right now it's one person no matter how long the discussion gets. So maybe Wickham could help divide up that work a little bit. As I mentioned before, I think there's a really nice use case for this tool when it comes to these like citizen democracy initiatives, right? So one aspect I didn't really talk about is I think this act of collaborative summarization, especially if it's kind of embedded, this iterative thing in the discussion, could also be a form of listening and reflection, which could be a useful mechanism for citizens to get on the same page. So more recently, I've been working with a few groups, like a startup and a government group, and these groups that are basically trying to have citizen discussions and then summarize those citizen discussions for city officials. Okay, so there's the tool. You can go play with it. So then after building Wickham, I started to think about, okay, we've done this for discussion forums, but what could this look like in the case of group chat? And then first off, like, is this even a problem in group chat? And we did some formative interviews, actually while I was here at MSR, with people who use group chat really heavily for work. And we found that this is in fact a big problem, right? So this problem where you go away for an hour, a day, you go back on vacation, when you come back, you have like hundreds, maybe thousands of messages that you've missed. And you have these long streams where when we talk to people, their main strategy for catching up on this was to just like scroll up in their window, their chat log window, until they got tired. That was like basically the only thing they could do. And you can see why this is a problem, right? Because like as you're scrolling, there's all this chatter that you have to weed through, right? Unimportant and important messages all kind of look the same. So to solve this problem, I thought about basically what are these like lightweight ways that people could try to add some signal to this, undifferentiated chat log to get at some of what is actually important. So maybe you could do things like mark when a new topic of conversation has happened, or say where a question was asked and link that to its answer, or when an important idea was brought up. These kinds of things. And the nice thing is when you have these signals over the chat, you could be able to do some interesting things over that. For instance, generating a summary of the chat where people, instead of having to go through and wade through all this chatter, could start at the summary and then use that as a diving point into the chat log. So a big question for us then was, what kinds of signals are people interested in? And then also, what does that final summary artifact look like? What do people actually want? So we built a bunch of different design prototypes of different ways this could potentially work. So anything from an abstractive summary of sort of like a written summary of a discussion that happened, to something extractive where you're picking out important sentences or chat messages that were asked or said. Things like discourse acts, where you're marking important discourse acts that were happening in the chat, to just like high-level signals like number of messages, main participants, topic of conversation, that sort of thing. And when we showed these to people, we came away with two main findings. So one, people really wanted structure, right? They wanted something that was really easy to skim. And for that reason, people actually really did not like the abstractive summary condition, which was interesting because those were the hardest to create. People also really did not like the extractive case because they really wanted context. So something where it's just kind of grabbing things out and not giving you any sense of what was actually said was also difficult for people to work with. So people actually really liked the third and the fourth of these. So from these insights, we built this tool called Tilde. It comes from too long didn't read, well-known phrase, which kind of sounds like Tilde, which Tilde is kind of like Tilde. So you can play with this and you can install this into Slack if you like. It works for Slack right now. So basically how it works is there's two ways to very easily add kind of markup to your chat. So one is via emoji reactions, right? So if you ever used a feature like this, basically anyone can attach an emoji to any other message. Another is slash commands, which is basically just commands, but typed in the message box of the chat window. And then in terms of what to actually tag, we came up with a couple of different discourse acts from our interviews, as well as kind of conversation indicators. OK, I'm going to show a video of the tool in action. You can, it's a little fast, so sorry about that. So basically, as you're talking, you can have a conversation kind of start. You can mark that you started a new topic of conversation. People are chatting and things are happening, but once something important has happened, maybe we've made a decision, we can easily mark that using an emoji reaction, like the decision handshake. And now that gets added to sort of an ongoing set of summary notes, where you can now just look at that instead of this like long chat log, including all these GIFs and memes being posted. You can also do things like add a note using slash commands, like I mentioned, and you can also link notes to other notes, right? So this answer is being linked to its question. Things like inline emojis also work, similarly to the commands. Since we were looking at this kind of in a more work context, you can also do things like assign notes to certain people. And then the nice thing of having done this is now someone who was away, they come back, instead of having to scroll through that chat, they can go look at the summary of that discussion and see the notes that people have left behind from the conversation. And then the nice thing about this is that everything is linked, right? So I can then dive into the particular part of the conversation I'm interested in, scroll around to see that context, and then that way get caught up. OK. So I'm not going to go into detail on all the lab evaluations we did. We did a number of lab evaluations looking at using Tilde and using something like a doc for taking notes. We also looked at people getting caught up using Tilde versus using notes versus using like the chat log itself. Overall, finding people were able to get caught up easier using Tilde. And then we did a number of field evaluations where we actually asked people to use this tool over the course of like a week, including two kind of like tech startups, one that was fully remote, one kind of research group, small research group, and a like editorial newsroom group also used it for a week. And here's one person in one of the tech startups really, really enthusiastic about Tilde. Was there a question? No? OK, you had your hand kind of. You have a question, yeah.
So this is fantastic, but I was wondering when you started introducing the topic, what are the organic ways in which people deal with this? So I was away for a week, I come back, and now there are 100 messages. I would say what happened, right? And then somebody would make a summary and then we start over. Is that what they do? I mean, did you research that at all? Like, what is a natural behavior?
So most people didn't say that. Most people said either they just like scrolled to try and figure out for themselves, or they just ignored it. They just were like, I'm just gonna pretend none of it happened, and if things are important, like somebody will tell me, or I'll find out about it later.
And now with the system, is there any retroactive kind of behavior? Like will people go back and annotate after the fact because they only realize after the fact that this should be annotated?
Yeah. So you can use that. You can do that in our tool. You can do it sort of as you're having conversation, or you can go back later and go back and do that. And
But do people do that?
Yeah, so we did some pilots asking people which they would prefer. And also in the field study, most people did it during the conversation as opposed to going back. And we had some early feedback that was like, once it's over, I kind of want to like not think about it or something, or I forget about it, that kind of thing. Yeah.
This is so cool, and I was wondering what you think motivates a user to do the work of marking up the conversation. Because I can imagine like it's really fun for some people, and for other people they might think it's like cumbersome to have to like figure out, oh, this question links to this answer, which links to this discussion.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways it could be used. So like for instance, in our field study, we had cases where it was more like you use it however you want. There were some cases where there was like a manager who was like, oh, we're going to start using this, like, please try and use it. And so I think there's both like kind of extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. Some of the intrinsic ones would be like, you can actually also get summaries sent to yourself. So you can be doing this sort of for your own purposes. We also had another case where someone was working quite actively with someone who was remote and in a different time zone. So he was doing it to sort of help that his coworker. So there's kind of different ways I could see it being used.
How do you think users would react if you had like a feature that showed who contributed most to marking up a conversation? Like, do you think that would make them more motivated, or is that just kind of that would add too much information to the chat?
Perhaps, yeah. I think we would want to test that. I think that would be interesting. Another thing we thought of, which we didn't experiment with, was, for instance, what if you had an assigned person for each conversation, right? So like some communities out there do this. So you have like an assigned scribe or something for every conversation, and you try to rotate the scribe, that sort of thing.
Cool.
That could be something we do. Yeah. Oops.
On average, how long do you find the things that were summarized where? Were just very short, like the example you showed a video, or they were like, after 3 months on maternity leave, I just come and I'm just like, okay. So what is the average length of the summarization? And if you see that there's a breaking point to the system where you need to start to summarize the summarization again.
Yeah, well, so there's kind of two things there, right? One is sort of how long is a typical discussion, right? And a summary is sort of like a summary of that discussion versus like how long will someone be away and how does that affect what they want to see, right? And we got some interesting feedback that was like, oh, if I'm away for a really long time, I want like a smaller summary where I can then like maybe have different hierarchies. So this is kind of getting back to like the first project where you have like these different hierarchies of summaries. We didn't get to the part where it's like now we have summaries of summaries, but that could be something that you do, right? When you have a whole bunch of these, we can say, oh, this was during our like, I don't know, 3-week sprint on this project. Let's mark it as that. And then you could see that at a higher level. Okay, so you can try out the tool right there. Okay, so now I'm going to move on from summarization to this technique of annotation. Right, so mostly just discussing the first project, focusing on education. So the tool I'm going to be talking about is this tool called NotaBene, or NB. It was developed in my lab by a prior grad student. Basically allows you to have discussions in the margins of a piece of text. So very similar to like in Medium, for instance, you can highlight a piece of text, attach a comment to it, and now people can have discussions in the margins. And this tool has become really popular. Like, I used it in my class that I taught last year, and this is a screenshot from it. And I think at this point we've had like well over 1 million comments, hundreds of thousands of users, like thousands of classrooms have used it. So it's become very popular. And I mean, you can see why it could be useful, right? So now it's really easy to reference what you're talking about when you're talking about it. Also, for people who are reading the material, they can then very easily see what discussions are happening. But we had this one issue that cropped up about 1.5 years ago, where we had this one professor who is a professor at UC Davis, and he teaches intro to biology. to a in-person classroom of 1,000 students, which is crazy. But he loved NB so much that he wanted each of his students, for every reading assignment, to add at least 2 comments in NB. So this led to, obviously, thousands of threads, and now, as you can see, this text is this like very useless blob of yellow. So to kind of quickly try and deal with that, we added this really simple feature, which is basically now students can add kind of emoji annotations to their comments to describe their emotional state, right? So are they feeling confused? Are they feeling curious, frustrated, etc.? Since we rolled it out, lots of usage, over 150,000 comments with these emoji annotations by over 6,000 students. So that was great. And not surprising, people are doing this. Like they're interested in having their comment be seen by their professor, right? But what's great is now you can do all these cool things with this rich data that you have, right? So one, we can now build these visualizations over the text. For instance, like heat maps or others, where a teacher can kind of like look at that piece of text and really quickly tell like, oh, this section was really confusing to my students. I'm going to change my lecture tomorrow. This section was really interesting to my students. I'm going to come up with some more examples, for instance. And also, of course, like richer data, you can now do some interesting machine learning on top of it. So being able to, for the untagged comments, also start to distinguish things like curiosity versus confusion. And then also, maybe at some point, like, can we predict which sections of a textbook is likely to be confusing beforehand? So this is another example of where I think this technique of annotation could be really powerful, is also in the context of code, like code documents, right? And enriching the representation of those. So, right now as a developer, if you see a piece of code, maybe it's on GitHub, if you don't understand why it was implemented the way it was, you maybe do git blame. You see who wrote it, you go talk to the person who wrote it, and then you have a conversation about why they wrote it that way. But once you're done with that conversation, it's gone, right? It's disappeared. So it would be really nice and really easy to link that back to the code itself for future readers to be able to see all these conversations that are happening around a piece of code. So this is a project we just recently started. And then really quickly, the second project in that vertical, which I won't go into too much detail on, but here we were thinking about this idea of being able to annotate things in NB, but broadening that to the web in general, right? So now using this browser extension, you can have these discussions in the margins of any page on the web. And not only just have conversations, but having a more sort of like social way of thinking about browsing, right? So kind of how you do in real life, you have public spaces, you have private spaces, and being able to bump into people. Online, you could also do this, right? You can bump into friends, leave notes, see where crowds are forming, see where trails are forming on the web. And of course, there's some like privacy implications of that, like not everything we do online we want to share with others. So part of the system involves being able to tell the system which parts you think are kind of public squares versus private living room spaces. But yeah, you can play with this as well. It's a browser extension. Okay, and then finally, I'm going to talk just a little bit about this question of helping people configure the delivery of content, right? So in a lot of systems today, it can be really difficult to actually tell the system, like, yes, I want to get this type of content, or I don't want to get this type of content, or I want to get it from these people, but not these people, or I want to send to these people, but not these people, right? So a lot of times we don't have that kind of control. So one really obvious example of this is the mailing list, right? So here's this 40-year-old tool. It's still the same. We all still use it. And so one of my first PhD projects actually was on this idea of kind of reimagining the mailing list to be able to add some of these controls, these flexible configurations back into the system. So things like being able to tag different emails, upvote emails, subscribe to certain topics or people, follow or block certain topics or people, things like just getting the first email of a thread and not getting any replies unless you follow it, these kinds of fine-grained things. And then also all being able to do this from your mail client itself as opposed to our specific site. More recently, we've been thinking about this question of email automation more generally, and basically the many ways that people would like to do these kinds of flexible configurations, but not just in mailing lists generally. So the first project here was, which we'll be presenting at CHI this year, so it's still kind of recent, was first just kind of like cataloging all the different ways that people would like to automate their email, right? So anything like, don't send me any notifications while I'm in a meeting unless it's from these people or mentioning these things. Or if there is a food announcement or talk announcement or event announcement, delete it after it's over or after a couple hours. Like these kinds of things that people said that they would like to do, but they currently find it difficult to do or can't do at all. So we wanted to come up with a general purpose way for people to author these different kinds of automation rules. First, using programming, perhaps a domain-specific language, eventually building a UI for non-programmers to be able to do things like program your inbox. But in the interest of time, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this anti-harassment project, which is basically what I would call like an extreme version of this problem of feeling like a loss of control over your inbox. So online harassment is, if you're unaware, this kind of phenomenon where someone or many people are trying to send you messages in a way that's designed to hurt you. So either they are emotionally painful or people are actually doing like a denial of service attack on your inbox so that it is now difficult for you to have regular communication. But in both these cases, it's basically causing you to feel like you've lost control. So we wanted to build a tool that could allow people to regain some of that control back. Since none of us had been harassed, we went out and interviewed people that had been harassed. It turns out they come from all walks of life. So, teachers, YouTube activists, politicians, of course, but also like climate scientists, doctors, even just people dealing with like an ex-partner. And we found a couple interesting things from interviewing these folks. So one, people get harassed in very different ways, right? So it's very kind of contextual to them. They also have really different ideas about what is harassment to them, and also different ideas about how they would want to deal with it. The second thing that we found that was really interesting was the most effective strategy after just deleting your account, which we don't really want to happen, was for them to give a password to a friend, and then that friend would go in and clean up their inbox for them. So here's one example of someone who did this. We thought, okay, well, this isn't really how you're supposed to use passwords, right? So maybe there's a way to design the system that can actually support this behavior as opposed to it being kind of like a hack. So from these two insights that I mentioned, we built this tool called SquadBox, a tool to help people fight harassment. And this is basically how it works. So say you're being inundated with a hate mob. You can quickly turn on SquadBox, which helps you set up filters so that messages that are likely to be harassing are sent to a set of trusted friends. Maybe they're colleagues, maybe they're your partner, etc., where now they will carry out your instructions for you, such as get rid of harassing messages or report them or send things that aren't harassing back to you, that sort of thing. And that diagram didn't tell the whole story, right? So because people had such different ideas about what they wanted to happen, we built in a lot of different sort of specialized configurations into the tool. So for instance, in some cases, people wanted their moderators to be able to sort of build up a whitelist or block list for them, sort of automating themselves over time. In other cases, they didn't want them to do that. Sometimes people actually wanted to see their harassment because they wanted to be able to respond to it or they wanted to know whether something was an emergency. So they had different rules that they wanted their moderators to carry out for them. So we added all these into the tool. So we did a short field study of SquadBox, finding some interesting things. So one was that over time, both the owners or the people who were getting harassed and their moderators were less nervous about privacy violations over time. Another thing that we found that was interesting was that the owners actually felt more guilty asking their moderators to do this work over time. And then the moderators felt that they weren't doing a very good job. Like they were more worried about not doing a good job over time. Meanwhile, the owners felt that they were doing a really good job. So this kind of suggests some follow-on work towards like relationship maintenance or like Thanksgiving, like in the tool perhaps. I just really wanted to quickly mention, so like we got some feedback on the tool. We're now looking to do like a longer term study. The tool is available and people are using it, but we haven't done a study of it yet. But here is someone who we interviewed who was a friend of someone who's getting harassed. Oh, let me finish the sentence. Who was basically talking about their desire for a tool that could allow them to help. Yeah?
Yeah, I was curious, were there any people who were both moderators and owners?
Not in our study, but when we did our interviews, to the people that were getting harassed, we asked them, would you ever be a moderator for someone else? And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes, which was kind of interesting because they were already getting harassing messages. Now they're signing up for more harassing messages, right? But what they said was basically that it changes the framing, like the nature of the kind of harassing message, right? First of all, it's not directed at them. Second of all, they're doing this in order to help a friend. It feels empowering as opposed to something directed at themselves. Yeah, so if some folks were interested in sort of like maybe an arrangement where with a couple of other people who are all getting harassed, like collectively helping each other once one person is like under attack. And actually some people had like Facebook groups, et cetera, where they were kind of counseling each other based on this already. Yeah?
Does it make sense that the tool also has a way to react, not just by passively filtering, by saying, I want to report this person. He seems to be doing something. He's a bad actor.
Yeah. Yeah, so we are interested in adding reporting features into the tool. So one thing that's interesting that I'm still trying to figure out is sort of like the legal ramifications of using something like SquadBox, like whether something that you report can actually be used in like a court of law. So I'm working with like the Harvard Cyber Law Clinic right now on determining that because I don't really know the details of that. But that is something we want to do. Yeah?
Could you go to the previous slide with the charts?
Yeah.
So I think at some point you mentioned like the moderators, you asked the moderators if they're able to like get emails to the owner in a timely manner and like do their job well. Do you think it's helpful at all to offer any sort of standardized training, or do you think that like the moderators know their friends well enough that there's no standardized training that would be helpful?
So we do add some, I don't know if I'd call it training, but guidelines in the tool, specifically like on like bystander support, like how to tell when you're dealing with like bystander trauma and that sort of thing, because that was our main concern. Other than that, we have elements in the tool where like the owner can give like, instructions to the moderator around what they would like to see. So, yeah. Okay. Let's go through these again. Okay, so looking forward, I've been kind of thinking about SquadBox in this kind of like broader sense of moderation in general, right? So on a lot of platforms today, you have on the one hand user moderation, right? So I, for myself, can block people or things, follow people or things, mute content, but that's all for me. On the other hand, we have platform moderators where the platform can decide like kind of top-down unilaterally to ban specific people, remove content, or like change the sorting of stuff that you see. But I do think there's this kind of interesting area in the middle that is currently a bit underserved, which is what I would call networked moderation or distributed moderation. I think SquadBox is one example. Another example is Twitter block lists. If you're unaware of this, basically people on Twitter collaborating on other people to block. Where I do think there are cases, harassment is a good example, where either the platform is not doing their duty or they can't, for whatever reason, step in. On the other hand, it's too much for a single person to handle, right? So what are these things that are kind of in the middle where people are able to help each other out? Another case where I think this idea of networked moderation could be really useful is the case of misinformation, right? Here's another case where maybe you don't want the platform or the government deciding what is credible content and what is not credible content, right? Meanwhile, I, on the other hand, for myself, maybe I'm too busy to fact check everything that I see. So could there be things that are more sort of distributed? For instance, maybe I could select specific entities, like fact-checking entities or journalistic entities, or even just people I know that I consider trustworthy. Then those people are then able to publish annotations or fact checks or these other things into the feeds that I see. So that's what I have been exploring with this group, the Credibility Coalition, that I helped co-found. And also with the W3C, there's a group called the Credible Web Community Group that's thinking about what are the standards around this, right? So if we were to build a system that does this, we need standards around how to actually show those annotations. Okay, so in summary, my research is on this question about reimagining new structures of discussion, giving people more power to be able to do all these different things in their discussion systems. So one question I get with this work often is this question of could we fix this problem just with algorithms? And what I usually say to this is that I think right now in their current state, algorithms don't quite get the job done, right? And that delta in which they're not quite good enough actually leads to a lot of problems. So things like algorithms for sorting your newsfeed or filtering your newsfeed, they have led to things like clickbait and misinformation, like I just mentioned. So part of the problem there is that the input that we're getting to these algorithms is really shallow stuff, right? Like likes and impressions and clicks. Where maybe if instead we were able to give more rich signals to these algorithms about what we actually want, then they might actually at some point be able to reflect the things that we actually want to see. So I do think maybe someday, but we're not quite there yet. So looking forward, I am really interested in this question of thinking about moderation and governance of these social platforms. How will, in the future, we will need to be able to combine both human and AI efforts around this, but also wanting to do this in a way that's respectful of user autonomy and maybe thinking about things like imbuing these things with more democratic values, because right now they're kind of very autocratic, right? Another thing is thinking about the possible discussion structures that are out there and trying to characterize them. So right now, on one hand, you have Q&A systems that have this very rigid sense of what is a discussion. On the other hand, you have free-for-all forums. But maybe there's all these other things that are in the middle that could be really interesting to explore. And you could start thinking about what are the ways we can summarize these different types of discussions or be better able to navigate through these discussions to get the information that we need. So one of the things I've been thinking about is extending some of the ideas that came from the Tilde project towards things like audio, video, in-person meetings, small scale, but also large scale, like facilitating town hall meetings. I actually have a project right now working on town hall meetings and broadening participation within town hall meetings. Really large gatherings as well, like conferences and rallies, that sort of thing. And then finally, taking some of these techniques that I've discussed, summarization, annotation, etc., that I mostly described in terms of information-seeking needs, but also thinking about them as ways to improve the quality of discourse for the participants themselves. So could things like summarization be a way of reflection for participants to actually improve things like reflection, mindfulness, empathy, etc.? And so just to conclude, with this work, I'm really hoping to have a better vision for online discussion, right? So we're kind of not in a great place right now. I think I demonstrated that at the beginning of my talk, where we're putting out these different fires of misinformation, online harassment, clickbait, spam, all these issues. And it's important that we deal with them, but I think it's also important to think further afield about what are the good ways that we could be having online discourse? How could actually be improving the ways that we conduct civic or political discourse or conduct remote work or have educational experiences online? So that's one thing I'd love to work on. So to wrap up, here are some of the other projects I've worked on that I didn't get a chance to tell you about. So I've done some work on kind of human-centered machine learning over at Google on clustered search results. I also run Confer. If you've been to Chi, CCW, or WIST, one of these conferences, let me know if you have any feedback on Confer. I also have done some work on kind of end-user interactive web publishing, so helping people who are not programmers be able to interact with data or build sort of data-backed interactive web pages. And also some more like computational social science work on social media analysis along with politics, looking at political news as well, and also urban computing. And all the people I've worked with, including some people in this room. So my Haystack group at MIT CSAIL, some master's students I work with, undergrad students I work with, other academics, both within MIT, in my master's as well, industry mentors, a lot of internships I've done, and then more recently the public interest nonprofit groups I've worked with. Okay, I'll take any further questions. Thanks.
The SquadBox model is interesting, mostly because you're taking a model that is very intimate to one person. Like mailbox is not a social thing; it's meant to be private to me, and you're creating a model that is built on sharing it with others and trusting the others with control. So I don't know under the hood how you envision implementing this. Is it by granting them your credentials, but them becoming you, or by a model in which like content get delivered to their mailboxes and then somehow routed back to, like, basically what level of control do you unleash between moderator and owner? What level of trust?
Yeah. It's more of the latter system. So we built our own mail client, basically, where it is able to access their IMAP server. So if they're using an IMAP server via the IMAP API, and so we can, through our client, go in and move emails around and send emails to other people, for instance. So the person who is their moderator would be able to get those messages sort of in their own inbox or in their on our website, as opposed to like seeing a view of this person's inbox.
And then how the annotation works on their end is basically like also something through your website, or like is it natively supported at the mailbox level, or it's basically something that they need to go to your website to annotate and then.
It's natively supported at the mailbox level, so you don't have to use any particular like client or anything like that, because it's all working through the IMAP API. The website we have is sort of like a useful thing, because maybe you can do it kind of like in a hacky way through your inbox, through like replying in certain ways and that sort of thing, or you can use our website. Yeah.
Just as a follow-on to that, because I've been in a situation where I've done this for a friend who's been going through a divorce. It makes me wonder, could there be a chat bot to actually do this? Because a lot of what has to happen is you have to filter out what's relevant, remove the emotional stuff, but also track things, especially if there's legal ramifications from what's going on. And it seems like those are the types of things that an AI system might be able to train to help with. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think possibly. I think part of the issue that we ran into was that different people had very different ideas, like I was saying earlier, about what they wanted to happen and what they considered to be harassing, where there really wasn't sort of like one model that could answer everyone's needs. So we did add in a machine learning component in the system where it was marking things as potentially harassing or not, and you could decide whether or not to rely on that if it suited your needs, but maybe it didn't. And so having the friend be able to go in and do things for you was helpful. Yeah.
I have a question from the online chat. Thanks for a great presentation. Is the source code annotation project for GitHub available to the public?
Yes, it is. It is online, yeah.
Okay. And that's
everything is online. All the code for everything and all the tools are online.
Just look you up, go to your website, go from there. Okay.
Yeah.
Hopefully Nate W. heard that.
Yeah.
I'll ask one more question. So going back to what about algorithms and kind of the hybrid system? So one of the things you hear in the news a lot about the kind of viral spread of terrible videos and disinformation campaigns and so forth. It's almost like it's too big. It's almost like it's too big of a problem. It's almost like throw your hands up in the air thing going on, and then you don't know how much to trust people that are saying that. And I like that you're much more optimistic. So what, I don't know, thoughts on just these, it's almost like a scale thing or something, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I had that one slide that was sort of like the range of things from like user to like community to like platform.
Right.
So I do think there are important things that platforms should do that they aren't currently doing. But there are also things that users would like to do that they can't do. Like, for instance, right now, it's actually pretty hard for me to tell YouTube, I do not want to see this kind of content recommended to me. Like, people have said that they try to do this and they still get it recommended to them. Could we make that easier? Right now, if you're a parent and you want to use YouTube, like YouTube Kids, it's actually a little dangerous because you don't have a lot of control over what kinds of things get recommended that well, actually. So I think some of those controls I was talking about, both at the user level and perhaps at the community level, could be helpful, in addition to what the platforms should be doing on their end. Yeah.
So I was wondering, given your introduction at the very beginning, have you thought about much bigger structural changes to the social media? Everything you covered here is about fixing on top of the existing, fixing the problems on top of the existing platforms.
Mm-hmm.
But what about completely reimagining how things are supposed to work? Like my hypothesis is that it's actually the identity of people, no matter how small, that's the problem in social media. There's too many people and you don't have any clout, so you have to be loud. Other people have too much clout, so it's like the extreme version of capitalism. But maybe you can reimagine the social platform in a completely different manner. And you kind of mentioned that at the very end of your talk.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think identity is one thing that's really interesting, where I think the direction that we should go is not identity as tied to my social security number or who I am specifically, but identity in terms of systems actually being understanding and caring about the history of your activity on a platform, right? For a long time, it was the case that a nobody who just signed up for Twitter with an egg could send messages and harass someone, just like someone who had thousands of, perfectly normal interactions, right? So these two entities are not the same, obviously. So could we actually reward and maybe give more responsibilities to people who have a good history of interaction, as opposed to people who have no interaction?
Someone is because there is a someone. So it isn't about the ideas; it's about people. So there is a someone, and so you want to be heard. You want to harass somebody. Somebody else wants to not be heard. It's about identity. It's about individual person. And what does identity mean when there's a billion of us speaking to each other at the same time?
Right. Well, I think the issue there is power, right? So I, as a nobody person on this platform, should not have the power to totally upend someone else's life, right? I think that is not something that a lot of systems right now correct for, right? So that's where I think the identity part comes in. I don't think it's necessary that we need to all have accounts tied to who we are as a person necessarily, but because I think that can lead to some issues around anonymous speech that you would like to support on platforms and people getting surveilled based off of what they say online, that sort of thing. But I do think it matters, what are your prior interactions on this platform? That should count for something. Yeah.
I think that brings up, or tied to a concern that I've had, which is that a lot of the online forums tend to devolve to the lowest common denominator. Mm-hmm. And you can deal with this a little bit, but there's been lots of people who were moderators for these things and saying, you feel like you're immersed in this dredges of society. And I'm just wondering, I think you're getting at that a little bit, which is that maybe we're empowering the sort of lowest common denominator too much.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how we deal with that, but again, most of these things don't really address that. The harassment does a little bit, But any comments on that, or?
Yeah. So I think that, so there is this issue of sort of low common denominator, like people having too much power to mess everything up for everyone else, even though maybe according to the community, they're not sort of like key players. I think there's this converse issue, which is that people who have a good history, who do care about a community, who do care about the level of discourse, do not have enough power on these systems, right, to be able to do things like more powerful forms of moderation. And another issue with that is that the moderation that they do is very much sort of hidden, right? So like you're doing all this moderating, you're cleaning up all the stuff, and no one else knows that you're doing this, and no one else knows sort of what are the problems that are bubbling up in our community, right? Where it ends up also kind of becoming this like shadow system, right? Like all these things are happening and you're unaware. And so I do think, one, it's like, yes, we need to empower people more to be able to have like good quality discussions. And then two, could we do it in a more like democratic way as opposed to like this very top-down notion that we have today? Yeah.
Thinking about all these comments made me propose this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that as there is accountability in the physical world, things happen, have consequences? It seems that on the online world, there are no consequences for me being a troll. I can just like change my identity, say something horrible, nothing will happen to me. So like I'll keep doing it. So I wonder if there are ways to bring some sort of online accountability so that your actions have consequences that affect you, and then level the playing field of community.
Like a keyboard with like shocked.
Just for example.
Follow closely, but
I mean, there's like people have been talking about like legislation around this. So like if you are, posting like revenge porn of someone, or if you are swatting, as they call someone, if you know that phenomenon, that there should be repercussions for you in the real world. For other things, I think we're not quite there yet. Like I don't. Even something like harassment, I think. So like the harassment project got a bunch of press and we had a lot of people commenting on it online, where the majority of the conversation was like, it's not real, you can just log off. And like that's the level of discourse we're at when it comes to online harassment, like trying to convince people that this is actually a problem, like people actually suffer like real consequences from being harassed. So I don't know that we're at the level of like real world like retribution for doing bad things online yet. But at the least what we can do is trying to minimize people's like ability to do terrible things online that we can. Yeah.
I speak about online consequences, not real world, not here. Like, if your identity is tied to your credit card, just cannot use it, or cannot log into Facebook for a week, or I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there have been things where people have been not banned from platforms, but warned, where you have like this like timeout period, basically, like if you were a kid or something, where you can't post for a little while, and this sort of thing. I think some of these things can be helpful in some cases. Other cases, maybe you just have to ban certain people. Yeah.
When I made my comment, I think you misunderstood it. I'm not talking about identity as being a good thing. I'm talking about identity being a bad thing. Even if it's fake identity, even if you just create a fake name on your Twitter account, you're still attached to this Twitter account. There's still a target, right? Your opinions are still being tracked and so on by the community. So, but what you're doing here is trying to increase the value of content. And in all your examples where things worked nicely, it was because content mattered more than the identity of the person who was talking about it, right?
That's right.
So then can you create a system where it's all about content, and there is no way of tracking anybody's opinions, it's just the opinions. So that there is no target, and there is no, and also you can't accumulate likes, or there's also no capital. It's just conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that works in some contexts and does not really work well in others. Like you might say like, oh, Wikipedia is just a place for content. Like it doesn't matter who you are. But actually there's a whole like social network behind Wikipedia. Like it really, when it comes down to it, it's actually really important who you are and your history. And so I don't think that we'll actually get to a place where that's the case actually. Yeah.
I have a subject limit. I have a comment about the Tilde chat. That's endeavor. It's interesting. Do you have data about how sticky was that practice after the users, passed their trial period? Like you asked them to use it for a week or so. Do you have data of how much of that sticked after the period where you asked them to use it? The key thing that I see here, like the key challenges, it's a promising thing. It's two things. Is one, you're building a solution based on the promise that people are willing to do work for others with no incentive. Like basically, it's for someone who's after they coming off so that they can catch up, and it's labor. The other thing is you choose a platform that is designed to be for small teams that people know each other. Like Slack is for the 2, 3, 5 type of people type teams that I just run on the hallway and catch up. Versus like platforms that are designed for 1,000 plus, like Yammer. Probably this might be more meaningful for Yammer. Conversations tend to grow. It's a multi-hundred type of people, number of people, that it's hard to, get caught up over the hallway or over, summary that people already know. So I don't know if two things, experience different mediums and different targets for where this applies more, and also do you have data of how much of that stick, so you can see the promise of, such an idea.
Yeah. So I think we still need to do a longer term study. There have been people using it for a while at this point. We haven't asked them about their usage or anything like that. In the actual field study that we did, we said they had to use it for a week, although we had really low requirements for what they had to do, and they very much exceeded that. And then they kept using it after the course of the week, I think across the board. But then we shut it off after a week and a half because it was the end of my internship. So it would be interesting to see. I mean, one thing that was kind of interesting was the activity was really high at the beginning, and then it tailed off a little bit, which we thought was actually kind of a good thing. Like it was a really high ratio of summary to the stuff it was supposed to be summarizing, right? Where we had one manager who was like, my team is summarizing too much. I want them to summarize more succinctly so that I have less to read. So I think part of that dropping a little bit over the week was sort of norm setting in around how to actually use this. But I do think we want to do a longer study. What you were saying about the number of participants sort of in the conversation. I mean, in the study we did, it was a few people, but on Slack and on a lot of these group chat systems, they do grow. I'm in a few Slacks with several hundred people, 600 plus on some of them. And for our study, we weren't focusing as much on the number of people, but the intensity of conversation volume. So, you can be a few people and chat a lot. You can also be a lot of people and just have a couple things coming in and out. So both of these cases are kind of interesting and a little bit different. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, let's thank Amy one more time.